Welcome to another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Today, we're going to talk to Ahmed Kaballo, CEO and founder of African Stream, a Pan-African digital media, which is totally based on social media. He has been reporting on various political and geopolitical issues from different places of the world, including in Africa, in Venezuela, Iraq, Netherlands, and so on and so forth. Today, he's joining us from Nairobi, Kenya, and we're going to discuss the developments in Sudan and in Africa in general. Ahmed, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome. So maybe we could just get your opinion on what's happening in Sudan as someone who's studied it closely in the region. Like, how would you describe as an overview what's taking place?
Yeah, where to start? I would describe it as, in many ways, an inevitable outcome of a revolution that was really unfinished. So when the Sudanese people came out to protest against Omar al-Bashir's dictatorship, they allowed a situation, I don't know if that's the right term, but I'm going to use it anyway. They allowed a situation where there was just a changing of guard. There was Bashir replaced initially by a guy called Awad ibn Auf. There was protest against that, and then he was changed by Burhan, and then people tried to protest again, and then there was, huge repression by the security forces. And then the protests kind of accepted this idea of a transitional military council that would make way for transitional civilian government. However, that never happened, and it was clear that that wasn't going to happen because in Sudan, the main industries, financial industries, are controlled by the army. So you have, the agriculture, imports, exports controlled by the army, road constructions, all of the major financial sectors are controlled by the army. And the army is obviously run by Burhan. And then the rapid support forces control the gold mines, which is one of our biggest, mineral resources. And part of the so-called transition to civilian government was there was meant to be a commission set up to dismember and disentangle Sudan's industries from these armed forces. It was clear that neither of these guys were going to allow that to happen. But what I find interesting is these guys had previously been closely aligned. They fought in the Saudi-led war on Yemen. So when Saudi launched its, genocidal campaign against the Yemeni people, it did it in a very coward-like manner where it used fighter jets from the sky, but didn't want to get on the ground and fight the Houthi Ansarullah fighters. So they used Sudanese soldiers as cannon fodder. And in that conflict, al-Burhan was leading the Sudanese armed forces, and Hemeti was leading the rapid support forces, and they were fighting side by side. And they also fought side by side in the Darfur region as well. And actually, that's when they first became closely aligned with the Persian Gulf kingdoms of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Now, if you was to ask me why the conflict has escalated recently, there's many theories about what it is: a power struggle, a jostle for power, etc., etc. But in politics, people can't ignore coincidences, and the United States had warned quite clearly against the building of a Russian naval base in the port of Sudan, and warned that there would be consequences if a naval base was to be built. So I wouldn't be surprised. Of course, I have no evidence, just speculation. I wouldn't be surprised if there are, intelligence agents in both camps, operating, doing certain provocations, knowing that it's going to get a reaction from the other side, causing this internal conflict, because the as part of the naval base, the Russian Federation said that it would only be built once it had been confirmed by a civilian government. So the best way to stop a civilian government from ever coming to power is have the two armed forces battle it out and destroy the country. Destabilization. I also don't think it's a coincidence. Again, I'm not saying this is fact. I'm just saying it is, speculative opinion. That Kamala Harris, the US Vice President, had just visited Africa and just had the absolute worst PR trip that you could imagine. She went to Zambia, she went to Tanzania, she went here, there, everywhere, Ghana, and everywhere she went, there were just sound bites denouncing her. In Ghana, the president at the time, still the president, said that there's an obsession in America about China's role in Africa, but the obsession isn't coming from Africans, it's coming from Americans. Said that in a joint press conference while she was standing next to him. In Zambia, before her trip, opposition leader, I think his name is Dr. Mbele, gave a huge, well-received speech denouncing US imperialism, denouncing the US's role in the region. And what was meant to be a trip to increases US's soft power in the region did the complete opposite. And now we have a situation where one of the largest countries in Africa is destabilized. Generals are fighting it out. And people are asking, what's the world policeman going to do about it? So in a way, it once again projects US power as a way of helping to, solve a conflict and put things out and negotiate ceasefire. So the Sudan conflict has been a very convenient conflict to happen at a time when, the US's reputation in Africa, or its soft power in Africa, seemed to be at an all-time low.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How they are losing they seem to be losing a country a week now in Africa. I just read that the DRC is now planning to sort of shift its international security focus to Russia rather than it's been traditionally European and American centered. So that's a huge step. DRC has a large amount of mineral resources for the African continent. So, I think what you were saying about the port deal in Sudan is reminiscent of the Central African Republic's destabilization that occurred a couple years ago, where they had a trade deal with China that fell through because of the onset of destabilization. Maybe you could talk. Do you think that there may be some similarity in that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anyone watches Narcos on Netflix about Pablo Escobar. Don't know if you've ever watched it. My Spanish isn't great, so forgive me. But there was a scene that always stood out to me, and the translation of it was either you'll take the gold or you'll take the bullet. And it was basically, he was going to police officers on the border and saying, listen, if we can't buy your loyalty, we'll kill you, basically. If we can't bribe you, we'll kill you, or we'll use violence. And I remember the Central African Republic, it was obviously a former French colony. The guy who was in charge at the time was actually installed by the French. I forget his name. I remember reporting about it at the time, but I forget his name. But then, not all puppets are loyal all the time. We have Idriss Déby in Chad was a great example of that, a French puppet, but every now and again, would try to do something independent that, would actually benefit his country. And I think that's what happened in Central African Republic. The Chinese offered them a very lucrative trade deal. And then after that, we saw the emergence of a group calling themselves the Seleka, which was basically a combination of mercenaries and Takfiri fighters that were not even from Central African Republic. They came through the north, you know, raping and pillaging on their way down, causing inter-religious conflict because they didn't attack the Muslim communities, but only attacked the Christian communities, which of course caused resentment. It made it appear that the Muslims were siding with them, which, you know, from my research, they weren't. It was just survival. And then since then, we've had, you know, conflict between the Christians and the Muslims in the country. The Seleka have left, and the country remains destabilized. And it becomes an example for other countries in the region that want to follow suit. You know, if you want to chart an independent foreign policy, if you want to chart, you know, an independent trade deal and leave us out of it, you know, the French see it as, after we've invested so much money, what they mean by that is, you know, colonization and investing in infrastructure to take the loot out of the country. So I do see resemblance. Obviously, you know, you're not going to get a French official admitting this on camera, the same way you're not going to get a US official at the time saying, yeah, we've destabilized Sudan because we're upset by a Russian naval base. But, you know, you can look at the circumstances leading up. The US embassy in Sudan had been closed for 25 years because it listed Sudan as a state sponsor of terror for inviting Osama bin Laden. Inviting Osama bin Laden, by the way, after he'd been in Afghanistan fighting on behalf of the US against the Soviets. But that's a story for another day. But anyway, Sudan was a state sponsor of terror, so there was no US embassy. US embassy comes back, I believe, 22nd of April 2022, and within a year of the US embassy coming back into the country, we have the worst violence that's ever been witnessed in the capital city. You know, the US ambassador, I think his name is John Godfrey, said and warned that the US naval base was a bad idea and it would bring bad consequences to Sudan. And now there's fighting and the Russian naval base seems like it's not going to be built anytime soon. So, you know, make of that what you will. I don't want to take responsibility away from the generals, because I still feel like, you know, unless you have greedy generals on the ground, this wouldn't happen. And these are greedy generals jostling for power, you know, trying to take control of the resources of the country. Burhan represents the old guard, represents, you know, he has the Muslim Brotherhood links, and has many Bashir cronies still around him. And then Hemeti believes that Burhan is threatened by his power and is trying to get rid of him. So it was kind of, you know, a preemptive attack, preemptive response. Either way, the country has had 7 coups since independence. I think it's second behind, is it Burkina Faso only? We don't need military men winning the country, whether it's Burhan, whether it's Hemeti. And I think the reason why we're in this situation in the first place is because the revolution was a leaderless revolution. There was no revolutionary theory. You know, if you look at Cuba, and there was not only leadership, but there was a revolutionary theory, which meant that when they overthrew the Baptista dictatorship, they got rid of all of Baptista's generals. In Sudan,
they sent them over to Florida. Now we have all those guys to get back in
Sudan,
again.
we thought we could have a revolution, but get rid of Bashir, but keep his generals in power. So it was almost an inevitable outcome. If you have a revolution, you can't have the key components of the former regime still in power. You know, the Janjaweed was created, you know, by Bashir in 2003 to fight against, a rebellion, an insurgency against economic disenfranchisement in the Darfur region. It was then used by him, in 2014 to quell protests happening in Sudan. It then became a mercenary gun for hire group that was used in Chad, used in Libya by General Haftar, used in
the Central African Republic,
in
right?
Central African Republic as
So
part of
that
the
very
Seleka
fight that
Force.
we're talking about
Yeah,
was part of that has connected.
Yeah, exactly. But thinking that you can have a revolution but have these forces in place, 100,000 Janjaweed soldiers, a military controlled by the generals. Umar al-Bashir apparently in Koba prison, but many people think that he hasn't been in prison for a long time, and that it's all just a hoax. Every now and again, they put him in cuffs, take a few pictures. One of his lieutenants escaped from prison, which then brought attention again to where Bashir is, and then the army was like, "Oh, he's not in prison. He's actually in a military hospital because he's been ill." The same stuff that happened with Mubarak in Egypt.
Exactly.
He wasn't in prison.
Exactly, yeah.
He wasn't in prison a long time before anyone realized he wasn't in prison. So yeah, it's just a lesson for, if you're gonna for African revolutionaries all over the continent about, if you're gonna have a revolution, you have to go all the way. You can't have remnants of the old regime still calling the shots.
Well, you
Because
have to have a real
Like-
revolution. That was
Yeah.
what I would argue, that this Bashir thing was just a color revolution that was basically may have been just completely orchestrated for the consumption of Western intelligence. I mean, like they could just know that, okay, we have to have this outcome for us not to get the bullet and to keep getting the gold, right? As you said, from Narcos. So like a lot of that dynamic isn't understood by the Western audience to these stories, is that there's pressures from these generals who, they have some responsibility, but if their choice is the bullet or gold, you can't really fault them for taking the gold and not taking the bullet and doing the bidding of the whoever's pulling their strings, whether it's a Gulf state or a Western nation who's telling the Gulf state what to do. So it adds a lot of layers of complexity. And if you follow the Janjaweed sort of mirroring the imperialist wars in the region, call Yemeni a Saudi war, but it was basically, if it wasn't for the U.S., the war would have never happened.
Yeah,
So
true.
it's an American war
Right.
in many ways, and so is
Right.
Libya was almost 100% American war. If you realize the pressure that the U.S. put on France and NATO to get that thing started, so I don't know. I just, it feels very suspicious to me where you have the Janjaweed bouncing all around to CAR to quell a Chinese trade deal, to participate in this Bashir ousting of Bashir when he was not doing the bidding of the international community. The whole thing reeks of the fact that there hasn't been a people's revolution. There hasn't been control.
But it was Bashir post 2015 was doing the bidding of the so-called international community. He's the one that committed Sudanese forces against the Ansar Allah Houthi fighters in Yemen. That wasn't a anti-imperialist thing to do. That was a very much in line with the imperialist agenda of making sure that Yemen doesn't, I believe it's the most populous Arab nation, doesn't become a sovereign nation because of its strategic, position on the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, etc. And obviously the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen was a very anti-imperialist, anti-US movement that, clearly wasn't going to become a puppet regime.
Right.
But so Bashir, people call Sisi a puppet, but the Saudis desperately tried to get the Egyptians to support them in the conflict. And I think Egypt sent like a ship with 3 fighters on there, like 3 people, 3 like soldiers.
Wow. Wow, that is the middle finger. Oh my.
Yeah. While Sudan, the Sudanese were doing were the biggest casualties in the war. do most of the fighting in the war. And yeah, I think people get confused about Bashir because in his latter years, as he knew the jig was up and he kind of heard the rumors that his generals were about to turn against him, he then went to Sochi conference in Russia, said that the US is trying to break up Sudan. He then went to meet with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. But these are just the actions of a desperate man in the last few moments of survival. It's like Saddam Hussein. Our sister will know more than anyone. Saddam Hussein wasn't an anti-imperialist figure.
Exactly.
He was supported by Rumsfeld and co. to basically destroy Iran, use chemical weapons against Iran. But once he fallen out of favor with the West, then he puts on the anti-imperialist cloak and starts chanting,
That's very true.
free Palestine and free this and free that. But before that, he was a CIA asset. I'm not saying Bashir was a CIA asset, but I feel like
He was playing into that.
yeah, he was a person devoid of ideology. The Muslim Brotherhood, which Bashir is part of, has been a cancer throughout the whole region. We saw what they've done in Syria. We saw the role that they played in destabilizing Libya. We can even go back in history against Jamal Abdel Nasser and the role that the Muslim Brotherhood played then. So the Muslim Brotherhood, they will just go with wherever interest they can find. They'll be with the Persian Gulf states one day, then they'll move back to the Qataris and the Turks.
I think that they showed their hand in Syria that they're very much playing ball with with Western powers. Like they're
And on that point, under Bashir, he was facilitating Sudanese people to go and fight in Syria.
Wow, really?
In
Wow, I
Sudan,
didn't know that.
Sudan, you'd get these. I remember being there, I'd visit Sudan. You'd get all these propaganda adverts on Sudanese television with the Syrian flag, with three
Really?
stars. Yeah.
Oh.
So it's like,
wow.
I always have to push back against this idea that Bashir was some sort of, anti-imperialist figure. He was a peasant that rose through the ranks, and then it was Turabi who was the ideologue. That actually, whether you believe in him or not, he was a person that believed in what he said. But then when Turabi became bigger than Bashir in the Muslim Brotherhood, movement in Sudan, then Bashir, put him on house arrest, detained him, and they fell out. And then in the last, decade or so, it was just the actions of a man trying to hold on to power. And that's why he built the Rapid Support Forces, which, in many ways, without knowing the intricacies of it, it seemed suicidal to build a militia force, a paramilitary militia force in your country of 100,000 fighters. But he did it precisely to prevent a coup by his generals, not knowing that the Rapid Support Forces would participate in that coup.
Because they're basically young thugs. Like the Rapid Support Forces are not a highly skilled, trained army. I mean, what they did in Darfur was just atrocious. And the conflict on Darfur came in at a very opportune time, and I think this is an important layer that we've omitted so far in this discussion, and that's the role of Israel. I think having seen up close and personal the referendum and the players involved there, having lived there and worked in the region during that time, like Israel was key to that. It was George Bush with the pressure of Israel to get that referendum thing kicked off, because Israel really was concerned about Sudan at the time, and one of their geopolitical goals in Israel is to focus not on their border states, but on the states that border their border states. They have a whole theory of power projection, where they work on the borders the states that border their border states, and Sudan was their main problem state in that time period. And so they developed this referendum process, and the problem is the referendum process was it was overseen by the Carter Institute. It was overseen by observers to make sure it was legitimate. And so they needed to make sure that this was going to actually be a thorn in the side of Sudan and not a win. And so what happened is, at the time, right before the referendum, is when Darfur kicked off. So there was this peace. They were having peace, and like Sudan was actually doing pretty well. And then Darfur kicked off, and now Darfur was the motivator for people to vote to drop the South in the North, because they were like, we're sick of war, we're sick of war. So this Janjaweed force, this RSF force that was being started ostensibly by Bashir, but I would postulate by outside forces, namely the U.S., was maybe in coordination with, or with the acceptance of Bashir, was a way of ensuring that the referendum vote was going to go through, and they're going to have a division because the Northerners were just so sick of having all these conflicts. That would be my theory. What do you think about that?
I think there was a bigger factor in the split, and that was the death, some people say assassination, of John Garang in a helicopter crash.
Yeah. Actually met
him. And you know, in Sudan, in South Sudan, everyone thinks that the US was behind that. Everyone thinks that the US was behind that.
Yeah.
Because obviously Garang's vision was a new Sudan free of religious discrimination, free of racism, free of tribalism. So he had no interest of becoming the president of South Sudan. He wanted to become the president of Sudan and wanted to liberate all of Sudan from, you know, a fascistic regime that, you know, claims to be Islamic, but goes against all the principles of Islam by stealing the resources of the country and whatnot, and discriminating against this group and discriminating against that group. So I think that, you know, the war in Darfur obviously contributed, but the way that happened, kind of similar in Rwanda, where, you know, a plane crash, you know, there was a plane crash and it was blamed on the Tutsi rebels, the RPF, and then that caused this, you know, anger amongst, you know, the Hutu majority, which then led to, you know, a horrific genocide. But in Sudan, in South Sudan, there's this, you know, it was a very suspicious helicopter crash.
But Garang was well involved in the. I mean, they had already agreed to the Arusha Accords, which was they had already agreed to do the voting and to divide the country. And Garang was, I mean, I met him during that process, so so I don't know if that played a huge amount. It definitely played, I think, a key role in how Bashir interpreted, like, his security after at some point, and probably is what we notice in how Bashir went from being kind of anti-imperialist to being like basically the lapdog of imperialists, because he saw how easy it is for the U.S. to just embrace someone, because the U.S. in D.C. was embracing Garang as this future for Sudan, because George Bush and Garang were meeting. I mean, Garang was the future of the new South Sudan, of like getting rid of these terrorists in the north and freeing this part in the south to be free of the. I mean, it was this whole like post 9/11 Islamophobia, and Garang in America represented like a way of saving these oppressed people in the south from this vicious Muslim northern government. So
yeah, I think he was presented
to see
that
him
way.
murdered by the very people who were embracing him. I think Bashir might have been like, whoa.
Yeah, I think he was presented that way. I'm not sure if that was his vision, because
no, I'm not saying it was his vision at all. I'm just saying in the
he
West.
was saying things like, for example, the Arabic should be the national language, which was, you know, controversial now to say that in South Sudan. But he was saying that, you know, that this is a language that we all speak. Even in South Sudan, we speak Juba Arabic, which is like broken Arabic, but we still speak Arabic. So, you know, I feel like in that situation, his two understudies, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, along with US puppet in the region, Museveni, orchestrated that, because soon after that, they presented it as if Bashir was responsible for the helicopter crash. Then the people of South Sudan went out and voted. I think it was 97% in a referendum. And then Sudan is now split. All of the previous oil deals that had been agreed with the Republic of Sudan are now reneged, because now we have a new so-called independent country. And now, all those deals have to be negotiated. All those previous deals were negotiated with China. Now they're, open again to business, to American capitalists and neoliberals. And then much like what's happened in North Sudan, the two generals the two politicians, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, start fighting each other over the spoils of war. Who gets to get? Who's gonna take the reins of this big cash cow? And I think that's kind of what, there's a lot of similarities in Sudan and North Sudan, because it's the same thing. Who's gonna get the biggest share of this cash cow? We know that there's money to be made. We know that Sudan has, gold and mineral resources, and there's all this opportunity. Who's going to be the person that's going to benefit? Is it going to be Burhan and his generals in the military, or is it going to be Hemeti as the new, he had visions of being the new elected president of Sudan. Weirdly enough, don't ask me why, and I hate even saying this on camera, but Hemeti was quite popular in Sudan, not because of anything that he says, but because of this kind of underdog. He comes from one of the marginalized regions. Sudan's kind of seen as this place where all the politicians come from Khartoum, all of them come from the central. So this idea that there's this kind of semi-illiterate guy from Darfur region, and he's kind of rose through the ranks. He appealed to like a lot of people in the periphery regions. That's certainly not to me and my family for the role that he played in not only the war in Yemen, but obviously against the Sudanese people in Darfur.
How do you think the normalization process with Israel plays into this current situation? Because I think that's another interesting difference between these two groups. Whether if you stand far enough back, you may find that the warring groups are both very connected to U.S. Western dynamics. They're proxies, but there is a difference in how they're talking about Israel.
Yeah, I think it was a test for the armed forces. Normalize with Israel, show us that you mean business, show us that you're willing to be a Western lackey, and we will back you. Now, the armed forces also provided support for the TPLF in their insurgency against the Ethiopian government. And everyone knows that the TPLF is a US proxy force that's been a stable US proxy force in the Horn of Africa, used to destabilize Somalia, used to destabilize to attack Eritrea, destabilize Eritrea. As soon as Ethiopia and Eritrea made peace and the TPLF got marginalized, now the US needs as many more reliable forces on the ground. And I think normalization with Israel was a way for Burhan to show that he's in, the US sphere of influence. And I think, part of Hemeti's attempt to jostle for power was to show that he was closer to the Russian sphere of influence. And that's why people call it a proxy war, because they think that the US's man in the, real dog in the fight, although they allude to Hemeti that they supported him, as he tweeted something about, he spoke to the head of AFRICOM or something like that, and tweeted that there was some sort of support there. But my assessment is that they support Burhan in this battle, and they support Burhan in wiping out the RSF, and they support Burhan in having a perpetual state of transitional military council, never ever moving towards true civilian rule. Because now that Ethiopia, which is one of the most populous countries in Africa, is now an independent country again, and has close allies with another independent country, Eritrea, that serves as a problem, especially considering where they're located, on the Red Sea.
And that would be, I mean, Russia is probably still a little bit sad that it's not building its port yet. So I would imagine that they would be very well inclined to help an outcome that would favor them. So the idea that Wagner, or whatever they want to call the Russian security presence there, would be it wouldn't be surprising to me, and it wouldn't be malicious. It wouldn't be a sign of like Russian imperialism or Russian expansion. I don't think Moscow's trying to turn Sudan into a Russian state, or whatever the bizarre Western media has the idea of Russian geopolitics. It's just simply sticking up for that having a port in that part of the world would be very strategically beneficial to Russia. So
it would. I mean, I've got to be objective. I'm not a fan of any bases or ports in Africa. We can't build a Sudanese. Totally. We can't build any Sudanese military base in the United States. We can't build it in China. We can't build it in Russia. So I don't want any military bases in Djibouti from any, outside force. But I understand the Russian perspective of, if you can't beat them, join them. Everyone else, I think this is the first proposed naval base for Russia, while United States has military bases all over, if you look at the map, all over the Sahel, all over Africa, and it's just looking to expand and build more. So,
real imperialists there.
Yes, I understand, the idea that Russia wants to protect its interest, but in an ideal situation, there would be no Russian naval base, there'd be no Chinese base in Djibouti, there would be no Japanese base, there would be no American base, there would be no attempt of a Turkish base, and so on. So yeah, just to clarify that important point.
Absolutely, yeah. There's genuinely need Africans for Africans, and that's what it needs to be. But getting out of the colonial mindset is a real challenge. So, but
so we talked about like the kind of major actors in this conflict and what is going on, and can you also talk about if you believe that there are also minor actors, like for example, some people mention Saudi Arabia or UAE or Egypt. Are they playing a role, and if yes, how are they playing into this conflict?
Yes, so we'll start off with Egypt. For Egypt, a civilian government in Sudan poses a threat to their own military dictatorship, what they call the threat of a bad example. It also obviously shares a border with Sudan, and it also has a constant, issue with the Muslim Brotherhood. It imprisoned Morsi, Mubarak in his time, which many people think Sisi is a continuation of Mubarak. There was an attempted assassination by the Muslim Brotherhood, I believe in Ethiopia, which was orchestrated by the Sudanese Muslim Brotherhood. So, it's interest are twofold. Number one, having a military threefold even, sorry, I forgot a major important point that I'll come to. Number one, making sure that they don't have a bad example on its border that would influence its own population. Number two, making sure that the Muslim Brotherhood threat is eradicated. When the Muslim Brotherhoods were fleeing Egypt, many of them went to Sudan. Now Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi are allies. That no longer happen. Sudanese Muslim Brotherhood can't find safe haven in Sudan. But number three, and this is actually probably the most important one, Egypt has this conflict with Ethiopia over the Renaissance Dam. Ethiopia wants to increase the electrical output of its country, even though it's a huge country with big population. Most of the citizens don't have access to the electrical grid. With the building of the Renaissance Dam, that will change. But with the dam, that will affect the water going into the Nile. The Nile ends in Egypt. So the Egyptian junta on many occasions has said that if this dam is completed, then they'll bomb it. I think Donald Trump even said that if Egypt wants to bomb the dam, he's got their support. And then Sudan is in the middle because obviously the Nile flows through Sudan as well. Now under Bashir, it seemed like Sudan's position was more aligned to Ethiopia. However, since Burhan came into power or took power, it's done a U-turn, and now it supports Egypt's position in regarding to this dispute over water, even though it's to the detriment of Sudan. So in Sudan, every year the River Nile banks flood and destroy huge parts of our agricultural sector. But if we had a dam that could regulate the River Nile, that would actually, be beneficial to the Sudanese economy. So Egypt desperately wants to have a client state in Sudan, so that it would support them in any diplomatic dispute that they have with Egypt, with Ethiopia, sorry, but also any militarily dispute that they have. And I think that's what this is about. Ethiopia and Eritrea are united, and it's important for Egypt that it has Sudan on side in case a conflict ever does escalate with Ethiopia.
Is there any other questions to Tara?
No, I think that's basically. But just in continuation of the previous question, is there anything that you want to add about UAE and Saudi Arabia's role?
I just gave a really long-winded answer about Egypt that I forgot about the other example.
Yeah, but that was very interesting because I didn't. I mean, I've heard about Saudi Arabia's and UAE's, but not Egypt. So that was very insightful. Yeah, please go on. Look.
So Saudi Arabia is an interesting one, and it's a shorter answer, so I'll go there first. So Saudi Arabia obviously had a lot of interest in Sudan because, like I said, Sudan was providing the foot soldiers in the war on Yemen, and Saudi was losing that war, and eventually had to, agree a peace settlement. But now the war has ended. There is, a disagreement on how much interest Saudi Arabia still has. It has financial interest. So the Saudi Investment Fund has put in billions and billions of dollars and wants to build up the port of Sudan, which again is the Red Sea. What's the other side of the Red Sea? The Saudi Arabia, Yemen, etc. So it has financial interest and it has strategic interest because that Red Sea region also leads to the Suez Canal and is one of the most important kind of shipping routes in the world. And then the UAE is, again, similar. It wants to build up, I think it's put $6 billion into building up, the port of Sudan. Again, trying to protect its shipping interests on one of the most busiest, most important shipping routes in the world. But it does, it does have interest in gold. Now, I don't know, I don't know how much of a gold consumer you are, but for anyone that does buy gold, they usually go to Dubai. Dubai is one of the leading, markets for people that shop for gold in the world. And Sudan has plenty of gold. And the owner of the biggest gold mines in Sudan is Hemeti, who is the leader of the Rapid Support Forces. So there is, just a classic neo-colonial relationship of an African country has mineral resources and a foreign power wants to extract the resources. At the moment, because it's done illegally, not through proper channels, the UAE is able to get the gold at a very cheap price, robbing Sudan of some very crucial, tax and funds. So I'm sure he wants to continue that, and he also wants to, get access to this vital kind of port, which is the port of Sudan.
Okay, that's very interesting to know. Yeah, thank you for that. Chris, do you have any questions to add?
That's really interesting. I didn't know that Hermeti was the
gold owner.
Knowledge as the actual gold baron there. That
Yeah.
may be
Yeah, that's
It
impressive.
was a gift given to him by Bashir, but
Fascinating.
to buy his loyalty. Like, you can control the gold. Just make sure that if these guys ever attempt a coup against me, you'll protect me. And then they attempted a coup, no protection. So it was a
Yeah.
bad.
Wow.
I
Wow.
suggested bad investment by Bashir.
Bashir should watch more Narcos because it doesn't seem like he.
Yeah, I suggest all anti-imperialists go and watch the Narcos Netflix series. Tells you everything you need to know.
Uh,
All right.
that's a
Well,
good way to practice Spanish too, apparently, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we should plan to do that. Thank you so much. It was very insightful, and I hope we will have you back at some point to give us more insight and based on what is developing in that region.
everyone
I'm going
watch
to
it.
wrap it up.
It's a great Instagram channel. I
It's
really think your
perfect.
content is amazing. Like,
Yeah,
Thank
I will add the links to the Twitter and the Instagram account of Africa Stream too, so people can follow. I'm a big fan of that page, and yeah,
you.
I will
And
make sure to share the links.
TikTok,
On TikTok.
our biggest
Okay.
platform is on TikTok. We've got, not to blow my own trumpet, we've got 273,000 followers on TikTok. So please
wow,
share.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
that's good because it goes right to the
Wow.
little kids' brains now. So that is the perfect platform. You get to like program some anti-imperialists from the cradle with TikTok. All right, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks
Go.
for joining us on another episode of Twice Told Tales podcast. Please like and subscribe and follow the links in the description to see more of Africa Stream content. Thanks. See you next time.